Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb stood in the center of the formal hearing chamber aboard the Sovereign's Will, flagship of the Caldrith Armada, feeling more nervous than he'd felt since his first combat deployment. The chamber was designed to intimidate, soaring ceilings that made anyone standing at floor level feel small, walls lined with ceremonial weapons and banners representing centuries of Caldrith military history, and elevated platforms where senior officers sat in judgment like ancient gods looking down on mortals. And presiding over it all from the highest platform was Queen Visara herself, ruler of the Caldrith Empire, looking every bit as formidable as her reputation suggested. The Caldrith were imposing, even when they weren't trying to intimidate. They averaged 7 feet tall with elegant builds that combined obvious strength with fluid grace, their skin carrying faint iridescent patterns that shifted subtly with emotion and lighting, and most distinctively, elongated ears that swept back from their skulls in elegant curves, and moved through subtle positions expressing meaning that Marcus was still learning to read after 8 months stationed aboard this vessel. They were beautiful in an alien way that Marcus had gradually learned to appreciate, though their culture's emphasis on rigid hierarchy and absolute discipline made them difficult for humans to fully understand or integrate with comfortably. Queen Visara embodied everything formidable about Caldrith culture, while also clearly being exceptional even by their standards. She was tall even by Caldrith measures, probably 7.5 feet, with silver-platinum iridescent patterns marking her as elite military leadership. Her ears adorned with elaborate precious metal frameworks indicating her rank and her numerous military achievements, wearing formal armor-like attire that managed to be both beautiful and clearly functional. Her eyes were striking, pale blue with internal luminescence that made them seem to glow slightly, currently focused on Marcus with intensity that made him want to fidget though he forced himself to stand at perfect attention. She'd ruled the Caldrith Empire for 15 years, having earned her position through military excellence rather than inheritance, and she had reputation for absolute intolerance of disobedience, for cold, logical thinking that showed no mercy to anyone who threatened Caldrith interests or violated her strict protocols. Marcus had violated her protocols spectacularly. The charges were read formally by a Caldrith officer, whose translation implant rendered the flowery legal language into something approximating. Lieutenant Commander Webb is accused of unauthorized use of Caldrith military communication systems, of making tactical decisions above his authority level, of overriding the Caldrith chain of command through independent action, and of generally demonstrating the kind of chaotic, undisciplined behavior that makes humans unreliable allies. It was harsh phrasing but not inaccurate assessment of what he'd done. The facts were straightforward enough. Marcus had been monitoring communications during a joint operation when he detected an ambush being set for a small human patrol ship. Standard protocol required reporting up the Caldrith chain of command for assessment and authorization before taking action. But the assessment process would take 15 minutes minimum, and Marcus calculated the patrol ship had maybe 10 minutes before the ambush activated. So he'd made a decision. He directly contacted the patrol ship using Caldrith military frequencies without authorization, warned them about the threat, and guided them to an alternate route that allowed them to avoid the trap entirely. It worked perfectly. The patrol ship escaped safely, the ambush failed, several human lives were saved. But Marcus had violated multiple Caldrith protocols in the process, and more fundamentally, he demonstrated the kind of independent action that Caldrith military culture viewed as dangerously chaotic. From their perspective, he'd undermined their command structure, set precedent for humans acting unilaterally without proper authorization, and essentially said that his judgment was more important than their established procedures. That he'd been proven correct in his assessment didn't actually make it better from their perspective. If anything, it made it worse because now he had justification for future violations. Queen Visara spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite not being particularly loud, her accent giving the translated words a clipped, precise quality. Lieutenant Commander Webb, you are accused of multiple violations of protocol and authority on my vessel. Do you deny these charges? No, Your Majesty. I don't deny that I violated protocol. I did exactly what the charges say I did. I acted without authorization using your communication systems and made tactical decisions that weren't mine to make according to your hierarchy. Then, you admit your guilt. Explain why you committed these violations. Marcus took a breath, aware that his next words mattered enormously, but also aware that he couldn't just grovel and pretend he regretted saving lives. Your Majesty, there was a human patrol ship walking into an ambush. Following proper protocol would have required 15 minutes for assessment and orders to be issued. The patrol ship would have been destroyed before that assessment could be completed. I chose to save lives over following procedure. I understand that was a violation of your rules, but I'd make the same choice again because 6 people are alive now who would be dead if I'd followed protocol. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Marcus could see several Caldrith officers looking shocked that he was essentially saying he didn't regret his violations and would repeat them given similar circumstances. Queen Visara's ears moved through several positions, analyzing what he'd said, processing the implications, possibly deciding how severe his punishment should be. Her expression remained controlled, showing none of what she might be feeling. You prioritized emotional attachment to your fellow humans over obedience to established authority. This is precisely the kind of chaotic, undisciplined behavior we expected from your species when we agreed to this alliance. It cannot be tolerated aboard my vessel without consequences. With respect, Your Majesty, I prioritized lives over procedure. If that's chaos from your perspective, then I guess humans are chaotic. But we're also alive, which seems like a reasonable trade-off from where I'm standing. Marcus realized he was probably making this worse by being argumentative and somewhat sarcastic, but something about the cold formality of the proceedings was making him unable to just accept punishment meekly without defending his reasoning. Queen Visara stood from her elevated position, apparently significant enough action that it caused murmurs from the Caldrith officers present, and descended to the floor level, approaching Marcus directly. This seemed to be breaking some kind of protocol based on everyone's reactions, but no one was going to tell the Queen she couldn't do what she wanted on her own vessel. She stopped close enough that Marcus could see the intricate details of her iridescent patterns, the elaborate metalwork adorning her ears that probably cost more than his entire year's salary, the intensity in her glowing eyes that seemed to be analyzing him in ways that went beyond just assessing guilt or innocence. You are defiant even while facing punishment. You understand I could have you removed from this vessel, sent back to Earth in disgrace, possibly face human military discipline for creating diplomatic incident with important ally. Her voice was quieter now that she was close, but no less intense. I understand that, Your Majesty, but I'm not going to apologize for saving lives, even if it means facing consequences for the methods I used to do it. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but something that might have been grudging respect or perhaps amusement at his refusal to be properly intimidated by her authority and reputation. Her ears tilted through a position that Marcus thought might indicate surprise or interest, though he wasn't confident in his reading of Caldrith nonverbal communication. You have remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity. I have not yet determined which predominates. Your punishment is 30 days confined to quarters with restricted duties upon return to active service. You will also receive formal reprimand that will appear on your permanent record. This is lenient by Caldrith standards only because your violation, while unauthorized and inappropriate, achieved objectively positive outcome despite your chaotic methods. She paused, still standing closer than formal protocol would suggest was appropriate, studying him with focused intensity that made Marcus increasingly aware of how imposing she was at this proximity, how striking her alien features were up close, how the height difference meant he was looking up at her in ways that reinforced the power dynamic between them. However, I find your defiance interesting. Most humans on this vessel are very careful to defer to Kaldrith authority. You defend your actions even while facing punishment. That demonstrates either strong principles or remarkable arrogance. Hopefully principles, Your Majesty. Though I've been accused of arrogance before by people who know me well, so maybe it's both. Queen Visara's ears tilted again. In that position, Marcus was starting to associate with amusement or positive interest, though her expression remained carefully controlled. Then she leaned in slightly, close enough that Marcus could smell whatever scent Kaldrith naturally produced, something like ozone mixed with something floral he couldn't identify, and spoke in voice low enough that only Marcus could hear clearly over the ambient sound of the chamber. If you were single, Lieutenant Commander, I would give you my number. Your defiance and your willingness to defend your principles even while facing punishment from superior authority is appealing in ways I did not expect to find in a human officer. But since you are bonded to another, and I am queen with obligations that prevent casual romantic entanglements, we will maintain proper boundaries. Remember that you serve on my vessel under my authority. Dismissed. She straightened and returned to her elevated position before Marcus could formulate any kind of response, and he was escorted out of the chamber by Kaldrith guards while his brain tried desperately to process what had just happened. The formidable Queen Visara, known for cold logic and absolute discipline, had just basically flirted with him in the middle of formally punishing him for serious protocol violations. That couldn't be what happened. He must have misunderstood some cultural context or translation nuance in what she said. But the memory of her tone and the way her ears had positioned, and the intensity in her eyes suggested otherwise, and Marcus walked to his assigned quarters for confinement, completely confused about whether he'd just been hit on by an alien queen while being punished for saving lives through unauthorized tactical decisions. His confinement quarters were actually quite comfortable, larger than his normal quarters with better amenities, access to communication systems and entertainment databases, clearly designed for officers being disciplined rather than prisoners being held for serious crimes. He had a window looking out at the stars, a proper bed, a desk with computer access to research materials, even a small food synthesizer that could produce both Kaldrith and human-compatible meals. It could have been much worse. What he didn't expect was that Queen Visara herself would contact him the next day through his quarters communication system. Her image appeared on his screen looking slightly less formal than in the hearing, still clearly royal and authoritative, but wearing simpler attire, and with her elaborate ear adornments reduced to just her rank insignia. Lieutenant Commander Webb, I am conducting review of your confinement conditions to ensure they are adequate. Are you being treated appropriately? Marcus was stunned that the Queen herself was checking rather than delegating to a subordinate. More than adequate, Your Majesty. I have everything I need, and the quarters are actually quite nice for what's supposed to be punishment. Good. Kaldrith do not believe in making confinement unnecessarily harsh when the purpose is correction rather than retribution. I have also been reviewing your tactical analysis from the incident that led to your violations. Your assessment of the ambush threat was accurate, and your solution was efficient despite being unauthorized. You clearly have good strategic instincts, even if you need better discipline in how you apply them. Thank you, Your Majesty, though I'm guessing that doesn't mean you approve of how I acted. I approve of the outcome. I disapprove of the methods because they undermine command structure that exists for important reasons. But I am beginning to understand that humans often achieve good outcomes through methods we Kaldrith consider improper. This is frustrating but also somewhat intriguing from an analytical perspective. She paused, her ears tilting through positions Marcus couldn't interpret. You mentioned during your hearing that you would make the same choice again if faced with similar circumstances. Most beings, when facing punishment, claim they would act differently if given another chance to avoid consequences. You don't claim that. Why not? Because I wouldn't act differently, Your Majesty. I'd save those lives again, even knowing I'd face punishment for it. Some things are worth the consequences, and 6 people being alive seems like one of those things. Queen Visara's expression shifted subtly, something that might have been respect or possibly concern about the implications of having a human officer who prioritized individual judgment over hierarchical obedience. That is very human thinking. Caldrith are taught from youth that following proper authority prevents the chaos that costs more lives overall in the long term. But I am finding through our alliance that absolute rules sometimes fail to account for exceptional circumstances where deviation achieves better outcomes. Your situation may be one such circumstance, which is why your punishment is relatively light despite the severity of your violations. The conversation continued for another few minutes before she signed off, leaving Marcus confused about why the Queen personally cared about his confinement conditions, or wanted his perspective on Caldrith versus human approaches to authority and discipline. Over the 30 days of Marcus's confinement, Queen Visara continued these periodic check-ins that supposedly were about ensuring proper treatment, but which increasingly seemed to be excuses for conversations about topics well beyond the scope of verifying his quarters were adequate. They discussed human and Caldrith cultural differences, debated the merits of emotional versus logical decision-making, talked about strategy and tactics and philosophy, and occasionally even personal matters like what Marcus missed most about Earth, or what aspects of ruling an empire Queen Visara found most challenging. Marcus found himself looking forward to these conversations, despite the awkwardness of their circumstances. Queen Visara was brilliant. Her strategic thinking was as impressive as her reputation suggested, but she also showed curiosity about human perspective that most Caldrith didn't bother with. She asked genuine questions, rather than just defending Caldrith's superiority, and she seemed to actually value his input even when she disagreed with his conclusions. And there was something else underneath the intellectual engagement, a warmth that seemed at odds with her reputation for cold precision, subtle flirtation that made Marcus increasingly aware that her comment about giving him her number hadn't been mistranslated or misunderstood. It was flattering and also deeply uncomfortable. Marcus was in a relationship with Commander Sarah Chen back on Earth. They'd been together for 2 years before his posting to the Caldrith vessel, and they'd been trying to maintain the relationship despite the enormous distance and the communication delays that made real conversation difficult. And now the Queen of the Caldrith Empire, one of the most powerful beings in this sector of the galaxy, was showing clear interest in him that went beyond professional respect. He didn't know how to handle it, didn't know if he should mention it to Sarah, didn't know if Queen Visara's interest was genuine or just some kind of test or power game he didn't understand. When Marcus was released from confinement after 30 days and returned to active duty, he discovered the dynamics of his position on the ship had changed significantly. Other Caldrith officers treated him with more respect than before, apparently standing up to the Queen and surviving with only moderate punishment had earned him reputation for courage that overrode some of their previous dismissiveness toward humans. The few other humans on the vessel were impressed and slightly nervous, uncertain whether Marcus's example made their positions better or more precarious. Marcus tried to settle back into normal routine, but Queen Visara continued to seek his input on various matters in ways that seemed to exceed what his actual rank warranted. She called him to strategic planning sessions where he was previously just a peripheral observer, asked for his analysis of diplomatic situations, requested his perspective on human reactions to various Caldrith policies. It became increasingly clear she valued his judgment specifically, not just as generic human input, but as Marcus's individual perspective. The situation that made everything more complicated happened during a strategic planning session about 3 weeks after Marcus returned to active duty. Queen Visara was meeting with her senior command staff to discuss how to handle a complex diplomatic situation involving a human colony that had resource disputes with Caldrith commercial interests in the same system. The Caldrith officers were proposing solutions that prioritized Caldrith economic advantage, which was logical from their perspective, but which Marcus could see would create enormous problems with human allies and might even threaten the broader alliance. He was present as observer, officially there to provide human perspective if requested, but not expected to actively participate in Caldrith strategic planning at this level. But as he listened to the proposals being debated, he found himself increasingly frustrated by how completely they were missing the human political and cultural factors that would make their optimal solutions catastrophically bad for alliance relations. Queen Visara noticed his expression. He'd never been great at hiding his reactions, and called him out directly in front of all her senior officers. "Lieutenant Commander Webb, you look like you disagree with every proposal that has been made. Share your assessment with us." Marcus hesitated, aware that critiquing Caldrith's strategic thinking in front of senior officers was potentially problematic. "Your Majesty, I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to criticize your officer's strategic analysis when I'm just here as an observer. I am making it appropriate by direct order. You clearly have opinions about what we are discussing. Speak freely and without diplomatic filtering. I want your honest assessment." Marcus took a breath and launched into explanation of why all the proposals would backfire spectacularly from a human perspective. He explained how humans would perceive each proposed solution, what political reactions they would trigger in human territories, how they would damage trust and cooperation, even if they achieved short-term Caldrith economic goals. His analysis was blunt and somewhat critical of the Caldrith strategic assumptions underlying their proposals, and he could see several officers looking offended by his implied criticism. But Queen Visara listened with focused attention, asking pointed questions that demonstrated she was genuinely engaging with his arguments rather than just letting him speak before dismissing his input. At the end of his explanation, she turned to her officers and stated flatly, "Lieutenant Commander Webb's analysis is correct. We were prioritizing immediate tactical advantage over strategic alliance maintenance, which is short-sighted. Revise the proposals incorporating his suggestions about human political factors and cultural concerns." The meeting continued with Marcus now actively participating in the strategic planning rather than just observing, and by the end, they developed a solution that served both Caldrith economic interests and human political needs effectively. It was better than what either side would have developed alone, proof that combining Caldrith logical efficiency with human emotional and cultural awareness could produce superior outcomes. After the meeting concluded, Queen Visara requested Marcus remain for private discussion. Once the other officers had left and they were alone in the strategy room, she addressed him with unusual directness. "You have a talent for seeing what we miss. Caldrith think in terms of hierarchy, efficiency, and logical optimization. You think in terms of relationships, emotional factors, and cultural contexts we consider irrelevant. Both perspectives have value, and combining them produces better strategies than either alone. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'm glad I could contribute something useful." "You do more than contribute something useful. You challenge my thinking in ways no one else on this vessel does. My officers defer to my authority even when they disagree with my conclusions because I am queen, and because Caldrith culture emphasizes obedience to superior rank. You defend your positions vigorously even knowing I could punish you for what might be perceived as insubordination. That is refreshing. Also occasionally infuriating when you are being particularly stubborn about something, but mostly refreshing because it forces me to defend my reasoning rather than just expecting automatic agreement. She moved closer, and Marcus, hearing when she'd invaded his personal space in ways that seemed calculated to test his reactions. "I meant what I said during your punishment hearing, Lieutenant Commander. If circumstances were different, if you were not bonded to Commander Chen, if I were not queen with political obligations that prevent casual romantic entanglements, I would pursue you romantically. You are intelligent, principled, courageous in ways I admire deeply. And there is something about human emotional expressiveness and passion that I find compelling despite my culture's emphasis on logical control and emotional suppression." Marcus felt his heart rate increase but tried to maintain composure despite his nervousness. "Your Majesty, I'm flattered, genuinely. You're remarkable in every way, brilliant, strong, impressive as both a leader and as an individual. But I am in a relationship with Sarah, and even if I weren't, the power dynamic between us makes anything romantic problematic. You're the queen and I'm a junior officer serving on your vessel under your direct authority. That's not a healthy foundation for any kind of relationship. I know, which is why I maintain appropriate boundaries despite my attraction to you. But I wanted you to understand that my interest is genuine, not merely a test or a political game or casual amusement. When I look at you, I see someone who challenges me intellectually, who embodies qualities my culture dismisses as weaknesses, but which I am learning to recognize as different forms of strength. That is rare enough that I felt you deserved honesty about my feelings, even though we both understand nothing can come of them given current circumstances." She stepped back, restoring proper formal distance between them. "Continue your excellent work, Lieutenant Commander Webb, and know that you have my respect and my affection, even when you are violating my protocols to save lives or arguing with my strategic assessments in front of my senior officers." She left before Marcus could formulate a response, and he stood alone in the strategy room trying to process that the Queen of the Caldrith Empire had just confessed she was attracted to him, that her feelings were genuine rather than some kind of power game, and that the only thing preventing her from pursuing him was his existing relationship and the political complications of a queen becoming involved with a subordinate officer. The situation with Sarah became increasingly strained over the following weeks. The communication delays between the sovereign's will and Earth made real conversation difficult. By the time Marcus sent a message and received Sarah's response, 12 hours had passed, which made actual dialogue nearly impossible. But more fundamentally, Marcus was finding it hard to maintain emotional connection with someone billions of miles away, when he spent every day in close proximity to someone as compelling as Queen Visara. He hadn't done anything inappropriate, hadn't acted on the attraction he was increasingly aware he felt, but he was also aware his feelings were shifting in ways that made him question whether his relationship with Sarah was still viable or whether he was just maintaining it out of guilt and obligation rather than genuine desire to be with her. During one particularly difficult long-distance conversation, conducted through text because real-time audio was impossible, Sarah confronted him. "Marcus, I can tell something's changed with you. You're distant in ways that aren't just about the physical distance between us. Are you involved with someone else on that vessel?" Marcus struggled with how to answer honestly without betraying Queen Visara's confidences or making the situation worse. "I'm not involved with anyone. I haven't done anything inappropriate or violated our relationship, but I am close to someone here in ways that are complicating how I feel about us, about everything. I don't know how to handle it." "Someone. The Caldrith Queen everyone's been talking about. The rumors have reached Earth, Marcus. People are saying you have some kind of unusual relationship with Queen Visara, that she shows you favoritism that raises questions about what's happening between you." "It's not like that. Nothing physical has happened. Nothing romantic has been acted upon. But yes, there's attraction, and yes, it's making everything complicated. I don't know what to do about it or how to handle this situation ethically." The text conversation continued in that vein for hours, with significant delays between each exchange making it even more frustrating. Sarah was hurt and angry, which Marcus understood completely. She felt betrayed even though Marcus hadn't technically done anything wrong, and she questioned whether they could maintain a relationship when Marcus was clearly developing feelings for someone else even if he wasn't acting on them. The conversation ended badly, with Sarah saying she needed time to think about whether their relationship could survive this, and Marcus feeling guilty, but also somewhat relieved that the situation was finally being addressed openly rather than him just carrying the tension alone. He tried to create more distance from Queen Visara after that, declining some of the invitations to private meetings that weren't strictly necessary for his duties, trying to keep their interactions more formal and professional. But it was difficult when she was directly in his chain of command, and when refusing her requests without good reason came across as either insubordination or as obviously avoiding her, which she noticed and questioned him about. Lieutenant Commander Webb, you have been declining meetings with me recently and maintaining more formal distance in our interactions. Have I made you uncomfortable in some way that I should address? No, Your Majesty. You haven't done anything inappropriate. I'm just trying to maintain better professional boundaries given the situation between us. You mean given that I have expressed attraction to you, and you are attempting to honor your existing bond with Commander Chen by avoiding temptation and maintaining distance from me. That is admirable but also frustrating because I genuinely value your input and your company beyond any inappropriate feelings I may have. She paused, her ears tilting in a position that Marcus had learned indicated genuine concern rather than just formal courtesy. I have put you in a difficult position, Lieutenant Commander. That was not my intention. I will endeavor to maintain more formal distance if that would make your situation easier. I appreciate that, Your Majesty. But honestly, the problem isn't just you or your feelings. It's that I'm developing feelings I shouldn't have, and trying to pretend I don't have them while also maintaining a failing long-distance relationship with Sarah isn't working well for anyone involved. My relationship with her is falling apart partially because of the physical distance, but also because I'm emotionally connecting with someone else even though I'm trying very hard not to. I don't know how to handle this ethically when I'm caught between honoring existing commitments and being honest about what I actually feel. Queen Visara considered his words carefully before responding, her expression showing unusual vulnerability that contrasted with her normal regal composure. In Kaldrith culture, we do not have a concept exactly equivalent to human monogamy. We form bonds based primarily on genetic compatibility and practical considerations rather than emotional attachment. Attraction exists, but it is less central to our bonding structures than it appears to be in human relationships. However, I understand that humans feel differently about these matters, that emotional commitment to one person carries weight and significance that casual attraction does not. If your bond with Commander Chen is important to you, I will respect that by maintaining formal distance despite my own preferences and feelings. Thank you, Your Majesty. That's appreciated and probably necessary for me to figure out what I actually want rather than just reacting to immediate circumstances and attraction. But maintaining distance proved extremely difficult in practice. They continued working together closely on strategic planning and diplomatic matters. They continued having the intellectual debates that both found stimulating. And the attraction didn't diminish just because they were trying to ignore it. If anything, the tension of suppressed feelings made every interaction more charged and complicated. The crisis point came during a situation where the sovereign's will came under unexpected attack from hostile forces, while conducting routine patrol operations. Marcus was on the bridge during the attack because he'd been consulting with Queen Visara about human fleet movements in the sector. During a particularly intense moment, when multiple hostile vessels were coordinating their assault in ways that threatened to overwhelm the sovereign's will's defenses. Queen Visara made a decision to use an extremely risky tactical maneuver, essentially using the ship's gravitational drive to create a spatial distortion that would disrupt the attacker's formation, but which also risked catastrophic damage to the sovereign's will itself if the timing wasn't perfect. The maneuver succeeded brilliantly. The attacker's coordination was broken. The sovereign's will's superior firepower could engage them individually rather than facing coordinated assault, and within minutes, the battle turned decisively in their favor. But during the execution of the maneuver, the gravitational stresses caused structural damage throughout the ship. An explosion damaged the bridge, and collapsing structural supports threatened everyone in the command center. Marcus acted on pure instinct, pulling Queen Visara away from falling debris and shielding her with his own body as the bridge's ceiling partially collapsed. When the immediate danger passed and emergency systems stabilized the structure, they were both on the floor with Marcus covering her protectively, both breathing hard from adrenaline and the shock of nearly being killed. And they were close enough that Marcus could see every detail of her face, the subtle patterns in her iridescent skin, the precise movements of her ears as they expressed shock and relief, the intensity in her glowing eyes as she looked at him. "You protected me. You could have been seriously injured or killed," Queen Visara said, her voice carrying emotion that Kaldrith normally suppressed completely. "You're the queen. Protecting you is important." "It's my duty," Marcus responded, though his voice suggested his motivation had been more instinctive and personal than just duty to protect a leader. They stared at each other for a moment that stretched too long, both intensely aware of their proximity, of the attraction pulling them together despite all the logical reasons they shouldn't act on it, of how close they'd just come to dying, and how that made everything else seem less important. Then Marcus forced himself to pull back and help her to her feet, restoring proper formal distance even though everything in him wanted to do otherwise, wanted to pull her closer instead of creating space between them. The aftermath of the battle included extensive damage assessment, treating injuries throughout the ship, and analyzing how the attackers had managed to coordinate such an effective assault. In the chaos, Marcus and Queen Visara didn't have opportunity for private conversation about what had happened on the bridge. But the emotional intensity of that moment, the recognition that they both cared about each other beyond professional respect or even beyond attraction, that there was genuine deep feeling despite all the complications, hung between them and made maintaining proper boundaries even more difficult than before. 2 days after the battle, Marcus made a difficult decision. He formally requested transfer off the sovereign's will, submitting paperwork through official channels citing that his position had become complicated by factors that made continued service problematic for both him and the command structure. He didn't specify what the complicating factors were, but he assumed Kaldrith Command would understand or at least wouldn't question his request too deeply. Instead of his transfer request being processed by routine administrative channels, Marcus was summoned to Queen Visara's private office for immediate meeting. She was clearly angry in the controlled way Kaldrith expressed anger, her ears positioned in sharp, aggressive angles, her iridescent patterns darker and more pronounced than usual, her voice cold and clipped when she spoke. "You requested transfer off my vessel without discussing it with me first. Explain this decision immediately, Lieutenant Commander." "Your Majesty, I think it's become increasingly clear that my position here is complicated by personal factors that make continued service inadvisable. I'm too close to you personally. It's affecting my professional judgment and creating problems in my personal life with Sarah. And I think a clean break and transfer to different posting is the best solution for everyone involved." "By personal factors, you mean our mutual attraction and your difficulty in managing your feelings while attempting to honor your bond with Commander Chen. You are essentially running away rather than addressing the situation directly, and making actual decisions about what you want. I'm trying to do the right thing by removing myself from a situation where I'm developing inappropriate feelings for someone I shouldn't be involved with. That seems like the ethical choice, rather than staying and letting the situation become even more complicated. Queen Visara's expression shifted from pure anger to something more complex, disappointment mixed with frustration mixed with resignation. You are correct that the ethical choice given your existing bond is to maintain that commitment rather than pursuing new attraction. But you are profoundly incorrect that running away is the solution to your dilemma. That is avoiding the problem rather than actually solving it. She moved closer, invading his personal space in that deliberate way she did when she wanted his complete attention. I will not approve your transfer request, Lieutenant Commander. Not primarily because I want to keep you here for selfish reasons, though I admit that is part of my motivation, but because you are a valuable member of my command staff, because your perspective has significantly improved our strategic effectiveness and our relationship with human allied forces, and because running away from difficult emotions does not actually resolve them or make them disappear. You will stay on this vessel, and we will both learn to manage our feelings like mature adults, rather than like adolescents who cannot control themselves around someone they find attractive. Marcus felt both relieved and deeply frustrated by her decision. Your Majesty, with all due respect, you're asking me to continue serving in close proximity to someone I'm attracted to, while trying to maintain a failing long-distance relationship with someone else. That's not a sustainable situation. Then end the relationship with Commander Chen if it is failing on its own merits. Do not use it as an excuse or shield to avoid acknowledging what you actually feel and want. If the relationship is strong enough to maintain despite distance and complications, then maintain it and we will work within those boundaries. If it is not strong enough, then end it honestly rather than letting it slowly die while you hide behind it as justification for why you cannot pursue what you actually want. Her bluntness was characteristic but still shocking in its directness. I'm not going to end a relationship just because you want me available to pursue you instead. That would be ending it for the wrong reasons. I do not want you to end it because of me or for me. I want you to end it if it is already ending on its own merits, if you are maintaining it out of guilt and obligation rather than genuine desire to be with Commander Chen. Then, once you are free of that bond and have made an honest decision about your own feelings, you can decide whether you want to pursue what exists between us or whether you prefer to maintain professional distance. But I will not let you transfer away to avoid making that decision. You will stay. You will face your feelings honestly, and you will make actual choices rather than running away. The conversation ended with no clear resolution beyond Marcus's transfer request being denied, him remaining on the sovereign's will, and both of them returning to their complicated dance of professional collaboration and personal attraction that neither was acting on but both felt intensely. Over the following weeks, Marcus did a lot of difficult soul-searching. He had several more conversations with Sarah that became increasingly honest about the state of their relationship. They both acknowledged that the distance was making things impossible, that they'd been growing apart even before Queen Visara became a factor, that trying to force the relationship to continue was unfair to both of them. They ended things in what turned out to be their final conversation as a couple, amicably and with genuine affection for each other, but also with relief that they were no longer trying to maintain something that hadn't been working for months. Marcus felt guilty about the timing, worried that he was ending it because of Queen Visara rather than because it genuinely wasn't working. But he also recognized, through painful honesty with himself, that Queen Visara was right that he'd been using his relationship with Sarah as a shield to avoid confronting what he actually wanted. The relationship had been failing because of the distance, and because they'd both changed through their experiences apart, and Queen Visara was a symptom of that failure rather than its cause. After weeks of consideration and numerous conversations with the few other humans on the vessel whose judgment he trusted, Marcus requested another private meeting with Queen Visara. When they met in her office, he was direct in ways he'd learned she appreciated. "I ended my relationship with Sarah. It was failing before you became a factor, but you were right that I was using it as an excuse to avoid deciding what I actually wanted. Now I've made that decision. I know what I want, but I need to understand what you want, and whether pursuing this is even possible given who you are, what implications a relationship between us would have politically and diplomatically, and whether we're both prepared to handle those complications." Queen Visara listened without interrupting, her ears tilted in that position indicating complete focused attention. When he finished, she responded with the honesty that was becoming characteristic of their interactions. "What I want is you, Lieutenant Commander Webb. I want to pursue the connection we have built over these months, to see where this attraction and this intellectual partnership leads when we are not constantly suppressing it and maintaining artificial distance. But I am queen of the Kaldrith Empire, and my personal choices have political implications I cannot simply ignore because they are inconvenient. A romantic relationship between us would be controversial. There are Kaldrith who would view it as inappropriate, as me demeaning myself by becoming involved with a human from a species many still view as inferior despite our alliance. There would be questions about whether I can maintain objectivity in decisions about human Kaldrith relations if I am personally involved with a human officer. These are real concerns that we cannot simply dismiss as irrelevant." "So you're saying it's not possible, even though we both want it?" "I am saying it would be complicated and would require careful handling and absolute transparency to avoid the appearance of impropriety or conflict of interest. If we pursue this, we do so knowing we will face opposition and criticism from both Kaldrith and humans. Knowing we will need to prove through our continued effective leadership and decision-making that our relationship enhances rather than compromises our professional capabilities. It will not be easy or simple, but then little worth having ever is." She stepped closer, deliberately crossing the boundary they'd both been maintaining for months, reaching out to touch his face in a gesture that was simple but profoundly intimate in its directness. "When I punished you for violating my protocols to save those human lives, I told you that if you were single I would give you my number. You are now single, Lieutenant Commander Webb. I am metaphorically giving you my number. I am saying yes to pursuing this connection between us, accepting all the complications that come with it, because what we have is rare enough and valuable enough that I want to see where it leads despite all the logical reasons why it should remain suppressed." They kissed, navigating the interspecies differences in physiology and cultural meaning through patience and genuine desire to connect despite the awkwardness, finding ways to make it work through attentiveness to each other's responses and willingness to adapt. It was a beginning, an acknowledgement that they were choosing to build something together despite all the practical reasons why they shouldn't. Because sometimes following your heart leads somewhere your logic would never plan, but which turns out to be exactly where you needed to go. The formal announcement of their relationship created exactly the political controversy both had anticipated. Conservative Kaldrith officials protested loudly that Queen Visara was compromising her dignity and authority by becoming romantically involved with a human, a species many Kaldrith still viewed as barely civilized despite the military alliance. Some human politicians and military leaders worried that Marcus was being manipulated or used for political purposes, or that his relationship with the Queen created fundamental conflicts of interest in how human Kaldrith alliance decisions were made. There were calls from both sides for the relationship to end, for Marcus to be transferred, for Queen Visara to choose a more appropriate Kaldrith partner. But there was also significant support, particularly from younger Kaldrith and from humans who saw the relationship as genuine rather than strategic. Progressive elements in both societies viewed the relationship as strengthening human-Caldrith ties in ways formal treaties could never achieve, as demonstrating that the alliance was deeper than just mutual strategic convenience, as proof that genuine connection across species differences was possible when both parties were willing to bridge cultural gaps through effort and communication. Marcus and Queen Visara navigated the opposition through radical transparency, and by demonstrating through their continued work that personal relationship enhanced rather than compromised their professional effectiveness. They were open about their relationship, while also being meticulous about maintaining proper protocols in professional contexts, about consulting broadly rather than just with each other, about proving that their strategic decisions served both civilizations' interests rather than being influenced by personal bias. They made their relationship public, but kept appropriate boundaries between personal and professional spheres, showing that emotional connection and rational decision-making weren't mutually exclusive, but could actually complement each other when properly balanced. Marcus found himself in the strange position of being both a junior officer and the romantic partner of the most powerful person in the Caldrith Empire. It required constant navigation of complex social and political dynamics, learning when to defer to her authority and when to challenge her thinking, understanding how to be a supportive partner while maintaining his own professional identity and credibility. Queen Visara was patient with his learning curve, and she made clear to everyone that Marcus's position on her staff was based on his competence rather than just their relationship, that he'd earned his role through demonstrated capability before they became involved, and that he continued to earn it through his work rather than through romantic connection. The relationship itself was a fascinating combination of their different cultural backgrounds and personalities. Queen Visara was accustomed to Caldrith emotional restraint and formal protocols, while Marcus brought human warmth and informality. They had to learn how to bridge those differences, her learning to express affection in ways Marcus's human emotional architecture needed, him learning to read the subtler Caldrith expressions of feeling that weren't as overt as human romantic behavior. They had debates that sometimes became arguments when their cultural assumptions clashed, but they worked through conflicts through honest communication rather than letting resentments build. Over time, they developed their own hybrid approach that honored both their backgrounds while creating something uniquely theirs. The relationship deepened over the following year. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences, navigated the complexities of being in a high-profile cross-species relationship, dealt with ongoing political opposition, while also building support from those who recognized their partnership as genuine and valuable. Marcus found himself falling deeply in love with Queen Visara in ways that transcended the initial attraction, loving her brilliance and her strength, but also the vulnerability she showed in private that contrasted with her public persona. The dry humor that emerged when she relaxed her formal bearing, the way she'd adapted to incorporate emotional expressiveness that her culture normally suppressed because she understood it mattered to him. Queen Visara, for her part, found that her attraction to Marcus had evolved into something deeper than she'd expected. She valued his perspective and his willingness to challenge her thinking. She appreciated his emotional intelligence and his ability to read social and political dynamics that Caldrith logical analysis sometimes missed. She loved his courage in defending his principles even when facing her authority, and she loved the warmth and passion he brought to their relationship that was so different from typical Caldrith partnerships, but which she found she didn't want to live without. 2 years after Marcus's initial discipline hearing, where Queen Visara had whispered that she'd give him her number if he were single, they formalized their bond in a ceremony that incorporated both human and Caldrith traditions. It was a major diplomatic event, attended by leaders from both civilizations, broadcast across both territories, watched by billions who had opinions ranging from celebration to skepticism to outright hostility. But Marcus and Queen Visara stood together, and made vows that blended Caldrith formal commitment with human emotional expression, promising to build a life together that honored both their cultures while creating something unprecedented. The ceremony concluded with both human and Caldrith blessings, and when they were declared formally bonded, the assembled crowd's reaction was mixed but predominantly positive, more people celebrating than objecting, more hope than cynicism about what their union represented. 3 years into their relationship, Marcus and Queen Visara had built a genuine partnership that served both their personal happiness and their professional effectiveness. They demonstrated that emotion, rather than being a weakness to be suppressed as Caldrith culture traditionally taught, could be a source of strength when properly integrated with rational thinking. They'd proven that crossing boundaries, between species, between cultures, between personal and professional spheres, could create something valuable and unprecedented when both parties were committed to making it work. The story concludes with a moment that deliberately echoed the punishment hearing where everything began. Marcus had just violated another of Queen Visara's protocols, nothing serious, but enough that she had to formally address it. During the private conversation about his violation, she looked at him with expression mixing exasperation and affection. "You are still violating my protocols, Lieutenant Commander. I sometimes wonder if you will ever learn proper respect for established authority." "Probably not completely, Your Majesty, but you knew what you were getting when you gave me your number." "I did indeed. I chose you precisely because you defend your principles even when facing authority, though it remains occasionally infuriating when you are violating my protocols specifically. And yet you love me anyway." "I do. Despite your persistent tendency toward insubordination, your refusal to follow procedures when you think individual judgment should override established rules, and your generally chaotic human approach to everything. I love you precisely because of those qualities, not despite them. You have taught me that emotion can be a different form of intelligence, that passion has its place alongside logic, that sometimes breaking rules achieves better outcomes than rigid adherence to protocol." She pulled him closer, abandoning formal distance entirely. "If I could go back to that disciplinary hearing 3 years ago, knowing everything that would follow, the controversy, the political complications, the work required to build relationship across our vast cultural differences, I would still whisper those words to you. I would still say that if you were single, I would give you my number. Because you are remarkable, Marcus Webb, and what we have built together is worth every complication." Marcus smiled, comfortable now in ways he hadn't been during that first hearing, when he was just a nervous officer facing punishment from an imposing queen. "I'd still save those lives and violate your protocols. And I'd still say yes to you, knowing all the complications. Because you're remarkable too, Visara, and I wouldn't trade this for anything easier or simpler." They'd started as officer and queen, as human and Caldrith, as beings from different worlds with different values navigating forced cooperation through military alliance. They'd become partners who'd proven that the distance between species and cultures could be bridged through courage, through willingness to acknowledge feelings despite logical reasons to suppress them, through choosing to build something unprecedented, because it felt right even when it seemed impossible. And it all began because a human officer violated protocols to save lives, because a queen was intrigued rather than just angry about his defiance, and because both were brave enough to acknowledge attraction that crossed every boundary, trusting that sometimes the most